And our question at this time concerns the subject of corporal punishment. Specifically, asking the question, is it right to spank my child? You know, as you look around today, our society and much of society at large will try to tell you, no, that it's wrong, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't, strike a child and what have you. But whenever you look into Scripture, you see quite a different matter, quite a different story. Because the Bible does speak about corporal punishment. It speaks about the subject of how to better train your children. And whenever you look into the Bible, in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, for example, he said, Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Now you'll notice, please, when he says to fathers to provoke not to wrath, but bring them up, raise your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. That shows us two sides of discipline, or two sides of training. First of all, you have instructive discipline. There must be a nurturing. There must be a caring. There must be a child who is taught the rules. They must know the rules of the household. They cannot be just assume that they know what the rules are. And so a child must be taught no. A child must be taught yes. A child must be taught what are the rules, what are the expectations of this house. When they fall out of line with that, now that's the time when correction is needed. And that's exactly what it is. It's corrective discipline. It's not revenge, it's not hatred, it's not anger. It's correction, to correct them and put them back on the path that they need to be on. To correct them and put them again once more in the parameters of the rules of the household. That's the whole point. And so whenever you think about training your children in the nurture and admonition, correction is very much a part of it. And we need to appreciate that. The Bible speaks about this. For example, he says in Proverbs 13 verse 24, Whosoever spares his rod hates his son. He said, but he who loves him, he said, is diligent to punish him. Now that doesn't mean one's looking forward to the opportunity. It doesn't mean one is looking for something to go wrong in the life of the child. But the point is that one is very careful to correct, and correct when it needs to be done. Now if you spare the rod, he said, you hate your son. Used to, a long time ago, there was an old saying that said, spare the rod and spoil the child. And that saying was used really as a warning. The warning being, if you spare the rod, you will spoil your child. And the point being, that is a bad thing. Unfortunately, as we've come into the 20th and even into the 21st century, those who have used that term, spare the rod and spoil the child, they use it to mean the idea that I'm going to go ahead and spare the rod because I'd rather spoil my child. And what once was a warning, what once was something said by men to say, hey, stop, don't do this. For the betterment of your child, do not spare the rod, lest you spoil the child. Then men have flipped that around and said, oh, I believe in sparing the rod and spoiling the child. In other words, I believe in holding back and only spoiling the child. Well, if you spoil the child, I'm going to tell you something. You start spoiling children, they're going to start to stink. I mean, that's just what happens. Whenever you have spoiled produce, it stinks. And whenever you have a spoiled child, he stinks too. And you look in the Bible, he says, if you spare the rod, you hate your son. Some people say, I love him too much. No, you don't. You hate him. Because if you love him, you want this child, boy or girl, you want your child to be brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and brought up in such a way as to be a respectful member of society and a good person within society and so forth. And thus there must be, in the household, there must be that teaching of consequences to your behavior. There are consequences. I'm going to tell you something. If you refuse to show consequences, if you refuse to allow your child to see that there are consequences to the behavior they have, when they get out in the real world will show them the consequences. And they will look to you, parents, and say, why didn't you teach me? Why didn't you help me? Why didn't you show me the right way? That's what's going to happen. If you spare the rod, my friends, you hate your child. And there's many other passages we could talk about in reference to this. And perhaps we will again at a future time. But I want you to rest assured, my friends, the Bible talks about it. It talks about it in the book of Proverbs several times. It talks about it in the book of Ephesians, just as we read Ephesians chapter 6. It tells us the responsibilities and the importance of making sure that our children are brought up, and that means brought up in a correct manner, which includes instructive discipline and corrective discipline.